Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm your host, John Drummond, and I'll be conducting proceedings for the next 60 exciting minutes. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. This week, we learned that the British government, listen to this, the British government is trying to thwart the unanimous will of the Scottish Parliament to better protect the nation's children. Have you ever heard of anything so ludicrous? And they're doing this smack in the middle of an election campaign. You really have to admire the intellect. Number 10. Crazy guys, crazy guys. Thank you for joining us this evening. We have yet another great guest, and I'm really excited that he is with us tonight. Tonight, the TNT show welcomes Chris Hanlon. Now, Chris is convener of the SNP's Policy Development Unit, and we will be talking about his experiences in that role and so much more besides. If you think about it, here we are, as I said earlier, right in the middle of an election campaign. Even the most apathetic voters at this time in a campaign start to think about policy. They look at the different parties and they think, how closely do their policies align with my needs and wishes and wants? So there's never, ever been a better time to talk about how policy is developed by the country's leading party. I will be taking your questions live. This is the noteworthy thing about the TNT show and all the shows on Indie Live, for that matter. They are not only live, they are free. This is your media. People often complain about the media in Scotland, but this is your media. Make full use of it. Get your questions in, and we'll try and take as many as we can. And if you want to find out how to do that, it's on the What's On guide. There should be a strap at the bottom of the screen that suggests the way for you to submit your questions. If you have any difficulty, you can write to me direct at john@cleash.com. That's John at C for Charlie, L for Leo, E for Echo, I for India, S for Sugar, H for Hotel.com. And I'll be happy to take your questions. So, the nation talks. This is very much your show. Please make full use of the questions. And again, all the details are on the screen. Now, to our guest tonight. Tonight, the nation talks to Chris Hanlon. Chris, welcome. How are you coping with the pandemic?
Oh, goodness. Are we still in a pandemic? I hadn't noticed. Gosh. It's kind of odd because in my job, with as a key worker, I'm out every day and nothing much has changed in over a year. So it's almost like there's nothing happening, but it's odd. It's odd because, you will occasionally have it sort of highlighted to you just how much it's affected other people's lives, because I get up and I go out to work every day and then wander about the streets and then I come home again, and occasionally you'll meet people and they've been locked up in a house for a year and they've not seen anybody, and you're like, oh, jinx, that's quite severe. So
what is it you do, Chris? What is your full-time
I'm
job?
a postie.
And so you literally almost certainly be the only person that these folks have seen.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, yeah. Some of the elderly, shielding households, have been locked away for, a lot of them didn't come out when the pandemic, when the restrictions eased last year, so they've been locked away for a year, over a year.
And do you find it affects how quickly you can do your round? Because I assume that people want to talk to you. They want to keep on talking to you because you're the first person perhaps they've seen for a long time. And you must be sensitive to the fact that, hey, I've got a round to do, guys. I'd love to spend more time.
It's odd. It's changed a bit over the course of the year. So early doors, it became, the mail kind of died down, but the parcels just, it's been like Christmas since March last year. And but because everybody was home, you got rid of them. You didn't even have to chat at the door a lot of the time. They saw you coming out the path, they were waiting on that parcel and they hadn't seen anyone in weeks. So the door was open. There's your parcel. So actually it was a lot easier to start with. Not so much anymore. Things have relaxed a bit and more people are working people that are working from home as well, it's much more difficult to deliver stuff to them because they're out the stairs in the loft with their headphones
Right.
on in a Zoom meeting.
Now, are you on foot, or do you have one of those neat little vans?
Well, I've got a van, but most of my work is on foot.
Yeah, yeah. I know Posty turned up today in some sort of rental van. I guess that's because this stuff gets maintained, and
Well, we've had to sort of disaggregate things because we work in pairs usually. So two guys share a van, one guy does the driving and the big packets, and they split the wheel between them. But because we aren't allowed to share the vans anymore, we've been time shifting half the shifts and trying to share the vans that way as much as possible. But obviously we've taken a lot of hire vans. If you were in the hire van business a year ago, you'd have been coining it.
Yeah. I mean, Amazon must be coining it.
Oh yeah.
I mean, every time I look the local roadway, there's somebody from Amazon delivering something at any given moment in time. It must be I don't know what their profit's going to be like this year. Astronomical, I should imagine.
Extraordinary in economic terms.
Yeah. So what about the family? How's the family affected? You've got 2 children, right?
I've got 2 kids, but they're both grown. My son still lives with us, but my daughter and my granddaughter, they live in Alloa. My wife and my daughter, they both work in customer service. They both work for Sky. So they've been working from home for the whole time. So
Dunfermline?
Yeah, in Dunfermline, but obviously
not right now.
Up the stairs at the minute. So my wife's commute has become substantially shorter. And I think her and a lot of her colleagues are very much of the opinion they're not going back, because what's the point? What's the point of commuting all the way to Dunfermline, 2 ways every day? It's an hour out of your day. All that fighting with traffic and fuel and wear and tear in the car for a job that doesn't need to be done in an office environment. It can be done remotely, like it's being done right now, and with virtually no difference to the quality of service.
But don't you think the downside is that people miss the social reaction and interaction?
Absolutely. I think there needs to be some sort of hybrid version going forward, where you've got some sort of small central office where people can congregate and speak to each other and have a sort of social communal experience. But there's no need to have all these massive offices anymore.
Right. Let me reassure your viewers that that's not sort of McEwen's brown ale you've got.
Oh no, the hard stuff, iron brew.
Oh, neat Highland iron brew,
iron brew, yeah.
Chris, tell us a bit about yourself. You were born in Aberdeen, but you grew up in Glenrothes, is that right?
Yeah, that's true. So I'm a child of the new towns, which is odd because it gives you a different perspective, but you don't realise you've got it until somewhat later in life. So I'm used to, my granny used to talk about the corporation, because technically the new towns weren't governed in the same way that normal towns were, with county councils and all that sort of stuff. There was an actual business technically that owned and operated everything. It transitioned away from all that in the 80s with Thatcher and all her reforms, but it was slightly different than a traditional town, I think.
Yeah. I spent 20 years commuting into Bracknell in Berkshire, which again was and what struck me forcibly the first time I went there was, where did all these roundabouts go?
Glenrothes isn't quite as bad as Livingston, but it is quite a lot like that. Roundabouts everywhere.
It's wherever you go, the new towns are encrusted with roundabouts.
Glenrothes has this odd sort of precinct structure, so it's it's built like little villages essentially that are all stapled to each other around a sort of central administrative area. Right.
So what was it like growing up in Glenrothes?
I suppose it was all right. It was much like any other place, I would imagine, any sort of medium-sized town. I'm a bit of... I don't think I really fit in at school, being very academically minded, so I was out of there as quick as I possibly could to uni at Edinburgh. But that was one of a series of missteps in a long series of missteps, I think. But you don't learn by not falling over and picking yourself up, do you?
Well, that's true. There's an old cliche that says it's not about how often you fall down, It's how many times you get up.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I spent some time in the States, and the whole culture was infused with that sense of anybody can do it. We should all be able to, every single successful business person, it would seem, had about 20 or goodness knows how many failures in their past. And there they were making lots of, but the old cliche about from log cabin to president, everybody believed that package. Yeah. Maybe we should have a bit more of that in Scotland.
It would be nice, certainly if it was true. I think possibly you'll find that in the States, just as anywhere else, there's a degree of sort of structural class divides that, while those ideals are there and it is possible to succeed, go from nothing to the White House, for the most part, people are stuck in their own class, just like they are in any other society, I think.
Yeah. I suppose, I think that's largely true. I suppose there is a difference, though, if you have a mindset that equips you to believe that you can succeed. It's I don't know how to describe it. It's a mentality. It's a sort of gung ho. Why shouldn't I make it? Of course,
Grit.
At least. Sorry.
Grit. So I've heard it described.
Grit, whatever. It's a. But if everyone preaches that at you, it of course it affects everyone differently. There's no question about that. But it is so. Here you were. You're a postie in Stirling. How did you move from there? What happened? Were you always a member of the SNP? How did you get to policy development?
I think, I got caught up in the referendum campaign like so many people did. And, I've always had an interest in all sorts of eclectic things. And I remember watching some of the early debates thinking, what are they doing? Why are they doing it this way? This is all wrong. And kind of getting sucked in that way. And eventually, after a great deal of sort of time watching from the sidelines, I know a lot of people that I know were, very active in that campaign, and that's not the sort of person that I am really. But I got very, very involved. So, spent a lot of time online, reading this, that, and the next thing, and becoming very informed about what was going on, but never actually actively taking part. And then the morning of the 19th of September was just, unbelievably awful, absolutely terrible. And, I vowed at that point, I was like, that's it. I'll not make this mistake again. I absolutely will move heaven and earth. This won't happen again. If there's another crack at this, I'll be dead in a ditch before we get another no vote sort of thing.
Okay, got it. Now, what was being done wrong in your view?
Where to start? Well, you've seen the white paper, the 2014 white paper. It's about that thick. It's about 1.5 inches thick. It's huge. And there's all sorts of policy decisions in there about how we envisaged running an independent Scotland after we'd gotten a yes vote that weren't really necessary. All sorts of decisions about whether we would keep the monarchy or what we would do with Trident or currency. the great shibboleth of that campaign. And very often you would see people in debates on the telly and they would be being quizzed about a particular piece of policy in that white paper that didn't really need to be in there. And it got them into all sorts of trouble. For instance, removing Trident, for instance, if a member of the public is from Helensburgh and they are, giving an SNP politician a hard time, it's very difficult to deal with that sort of thing, when reality is that the independence referendum was about giving the choices about how Scotland was to be run to the people of Scotland. And effectively what the white paper did was take half of those choices away again. And I think that was a mistake, because every time you make a decision like that, you don't have to, you lose a voter.
It's interesting you should say that. There was a paper published this week by Professor Kieran Martin. Are you aware of it?
Maybe, maybe not. Remind me.
But essentially, he was in charge of, he was the civil servant the top honcho in the British government in 2014. And he has come out with an overview of what he calls Resist, Reform, Rerun. I think that's the title of his paper.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially what he was saying is that, well, if I can use one of his summaries and try and remember it without paraphrasing it too badly, essentially he was saying that the 2014 referendum was a good process, it was replicable. We should stick with that if there's another referendum. But he was also saying it was made unnecessarily complex. He said, because even though it's a huge political question, it's a straightforward one.
Yeah.
And there's no need to make it complex, which seems to largely echo what you just said.
Yeah, I think it was that complexity that became a problem for our campaign, that by answering questions that didn't need to be answered until after a yes vote, until after independence, every time you did that, there was some segment of the population that was on the verge of voting yes that you put off, whether it was Republicans or, pro-nuclear deterrent people, or, people with just conservative economic opinions. These things all had an impact on a variety of voters that might otherwise have voted yes, because they could then, construct a vision of the sort of country they wanted to live in their own minds, instead of having it foisted upon them by us, which I think is a mistake. We should be producing a smorgasbord of possible visions of an independent Scotland. These are the things you could do if you had the power of an independent country. Which ones you want to do are going to be entirely up to you, but all of these things are the possibilities. So a buffet of possibility.
A buffet,
rather than a straitjacket.
Yeah. A smorgasbord of possibility. So, what is your approach then in policy development? Are you aiming to hone all of this stuff down into the salient, essential policies this time around? Is that what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think that would be what we would look to try and advocate for, certainly. I mean, that's really something that's, that sort of policy direction of the party overall is up to the NEC, but that's certainly what I would be looking to do on the Policy Development Committee. I mean, I've really got two functions there. One is to help party members to facilitate other people to develop the policy ideas that they're interested in. It's not my job to foist my policies on other people, which is what I was just complaining about. So, it's my job to make it easier for the grassroots, the party in general, to talk about policy, to examine the evidence and reach a consensus, and then bring that to conference and actually bring it into party policy. But certainly the overall aim, the sort of long-term strategy, is to be looking to, what are we going to present to the Scottish people in this next referendum? All things being equal, we're going to have a landslide for independence on the 6th of May. We're going to hold a referendum as soon as we can practically do so. And, when we're doing that, we're going to have a vision to sell the people of Scotland. And so we're trying our best to produce that vision at this point.
So let me get this right, so make sure I understand it. Your sense is that you would like ordinary members of the SNP to get involved in policy development. Is that the case?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the way the SNP is set up. Policy in the SNP, the ultimate arbiter of policies, is annual conference, which is, staffed by ordinary members going as delegates, and they sift through the resolutions that have been placed on the agenda by other ordinary members, branches, and so forth and so on, and they make decisions as to what policies to adopt and reject or modify. So ultimately, all the policies of the Scottish National Party were developed by their members and approved at conference.
These policies get developed and they get put before national conference, but only if the people running the conference agree that these are suitable policies to be debated or discussed. Is that the case?
Well, technically, if the conference committee agrees that they are competent, so if they're well written, as opposed to, not being the sort of thing that is potentially actionable or internally inconsistent or not consistent with the law or with the various regulations around whatever policy you're talking about functions. So long as something's competent, it's not really up to myself or the conference committee that actually prepares the agendas to prejudge resolutions, prejudge policy ideas. That's entirely up to conference delegates to decide whether they think something's appropriate or not.
But how do they do that if their role ceases?
Well,
the resolution is presented or suggested. Somebody either comes back and says yes or no.
So at present, the way the system should function is that when you've got a conference, so we're hopefully going to have a summer conference end of June, start of July. When we announce the date for that, we'll announce a cut-off date for submission of resolutions. When those resolutions are all brought in, the conference committee will go through them, sift through them, and decide which ones are competent, which ones aren't. If something is already party policy, we won't bother putting it on the agenda because that's kind of a waste of time. And they should produce a short list of maybe 40 or 50 resolutions that have been submitted that are competent, and we put them out to the members, to the delegates, to say, which of these do you actually want to discuss? And they get to vote on them, and the ones that are most popular are the ones that end up on the agenda.
Now, do you have any role in that process?
Well, I'm, as the Policy Development Committee, I'm a member of the conference committee, so I'm present in those meetings and have a vote. But obviously, there are other people in the room. There are other opinions available.
So your role is first of all to encourage people to submit policy suggestions
and to make sure as much as possible that the stuff that they submit is competent already before it actually gets to the conference committee. Because what was happening before, because this current committee structure is new, there used to be just one committee called SOAC, the Standing Orders and Agenda Committee, and it would just get this deluge, this tsunami of resolutions in before conference, most of which were very poorly written and ended up having to be rejected. But that was a big job. I'd sat on that committee for a couple of years, and you would get this just stack of stuff, and you would have a day if you were lucky to go through it all. So what should be happening is this new committee structure is the Policy Development Committee acts as a filter that meets all year round, that works with branches and individuals throughout the year, so that as people are developing policy resolutions, we are helping them ensure that they are well structured and coherent and competent, and have support from the widest possible cross-section of the party already before they're presented to the conference committee, which hopefully should streamline things.
So how do you acquit yourself of this educational role? I mean, do you actually send information out to branches saying, look, here's some guidance about how to frame a resolution or a view or something. And then your other role is to say, okay, here are these resolutions coming in. We act as a filter so that the stuff that's not competent gets caught with us, and the rest goes through, and somebody else makes a decision about whether there's enough time and all the rest of that.
Yeah. So every branch has a political education officer. So I'm in contact with all of the political education officers. So I regularly email out to them and let them know what's happening. And so I will send them out. For instance, there's existing guidance on how to draft resolutions. It's not ideal, but it's a good place to start. So I sent that out to them a month or so ago, just when it became apparent that we were likely to have a conference in the near future. And I'll work with them, as they come to me to produce resolutions. That should also sort of interface with our National Assembly, which runs should run monthly, but things are a bit iffy in the middle of a pandemic. But and that's not a deliberative, it's not a decisive assembly. It doesn't make decisions. It's our opportunity to discuss things in private and mull things over, and have a back and forth to actually distill the various ideas that are going around the party into some sort of consensus opinion, which should hopefully allow us to work through more difficult or contentious issues before it actually comes to sending resolutions to conference.
Got it. We've had a question from Charles Smith, and he's asking, is the SNP's workload realistic, particularly in the event of independence?
Well, that's something we're working on at the minute. As part of my role, what I've done is I've set up a number of expert working groups to look at the sort of policy and practical areas that well, as a committee, we thought were the most pressing. So obviously, the transition to independence is a big step. It's a massive step. If you look at the balance of power, where it lies between Holyrood and Westminster, you look at a list of reserved powers. There's a lot of stuff on that list. And, at present, we have civil servants working for Holyrood dealing with all the devolved issues. But, we need an entire civil service infrastructure to deal with all the other issues that are currently managed by, Westminster and Westminster departments, So, DVLA is in Cardiff. So we need to work out, how we're going to deal with that. Or at the very least, we need to work out how we're going to go about working out how we're going to deal with that. So, realistic, yes, it's going to be a push. I'm sure a lot of your viewers will have seen Commonwealth's book, How to Build a Better Nation, is it? Craig will kill me because I can't remember the title of his book, but that details quite well, all the sort of steps that you need to take really to move from where we are now, the devolved settlement, into full independence, and sort of timescales and breaks it down into blocks. So, that's not exactly what we're going to do. That's a sort of broad sort of template we work from.
It's interesting because I think I mentioned earlier there were 2 reports issued this week, and the other report, in fact, is an overview by some Cambridge academics looking at the issues with devolution. And their point is that the main ministries in Westminster and Whitehall, rather, pay almost no regard to devolution. It's not in their top 50 priorities. It just doesn't feature anywhere. And the poor man who produced this report with a colleague explains that he tried time and time again from the centre, i.e. from the Cabinet Office, whatever, to encourage the various ministries to become more proactive. And I think his final accounting was it just didn't work, and it's never going to work. I suspect part of that, and in fairness to everyone, is the fact that devolution is a singularly odd arrangement, in the UK, because it's unbalanced. It's not like there was devolution for everyone. There was devolution for 3 parts of the UK, and pretty much nothing for anyone else. And that's a very unbalanced arrangement. And you can understand why somebody at the centre thinks this is not a priority for me, and therefore, it just goes by default. It's like a badly made suit. It fits where it touches. These are my words, not their words. So therefore, on the face of that, you would think, well, maybe it's maybe not quite as onerous as it might look at first, because there's not a lot of support there anyway.
Yeah.
Presumably, that means a lot of the heavy lifting is being done presently by Holyrood. If the so-called main ministries are paying little attention to it, it means that somebody, if it is getting done, it was getting done at Holyrood rather than elsewhere. Or it's not getting done at all. Maybe that's the point.
Well, certainly there's a lot of areas where I think Holyrood is kind of stepping in and taking responsibility for reserved areas. Broadband, for instance, just for a personal bugbear for you there.
Yeah.
That's a reserved issue, broadband, and yet we are investing hundreds of millions of pounds trying to get high-speed broadband out to every premises in Scotland, which is a massive ask. And not our responsibility, not something we get budget for really, but something that's absolutely necessary. So we're just taking it on and doing it.
Yeah.
And asking for forgiveness later.
I'll tell you. This is a concern that gets expressed in many of our shows. And by the way, we've done 49 so far. This is our 49th show. Our 50th show comes up next week, and we're all very proud of that, because that's almost a year of shows, pretty much uninterrupted. and we have great guests, which is super, like yourself. But a theme that comes through all the time, and it's about policy, and it's this. There's lots of policies. There's lots of things going on in Scotland. What's missing is what's missing is the foundation. In other words, if you take a typical state and compare it to a house, then the foundations of that state are a constitution upon which there has been a fairly universal agreement and which embodies the placement of sovereignty, which is crucial because the Westminster view of sovereignty is it lies with the Crown and Parliament. A view that resonates more in Scotland is that sovereignty rests with the people. And I take it you probably agree with that. That seems to be a general sentiment.
It does seem to be my Twitter handle.
Exactly. Now, in the light of that and the importance that you personally attach to it, how come there isn't a draft constitution for Scotland already in place? Because at a minimum, it is a contract between the state and the citizen. And it's also a contract between the state and other states. And without that, what you've got essentially is what exists in London, which is an ad hoc amalgam of all sorts of different policies, procedures, and conventions, and rules, and statements by various academics. In other words, it's a mare's nest. And you would have thought on the face of it that Scotland would want to go down a very different route and be very clear. Am I right?
So, yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly, 100%. And, you know, I've talked to a number of people, Mark McNaught, Dr. Elliot Bulmer, a few other folk who are also of a like mind, who really think that, you know, the Constitution is important. It's a fundamental, foundational document. You absolutely have to have and have to get right. It's something that's on our roadmap. It's not something we're presently dealing with. We're, you know, trying to deal with more short-term stuff. But, you know, when we're coming up to an independence referendum, we're going to have at least an interim constitution. What I have found over the years, because I agree, completely agree, I think it's, you know, critically important that this is something that we do, and there are a few other people that agree with me, comes right down to it, most people are all talk. When you actually say, right, let's sit down and we'll write a constitution, very often there's deafening silence apart from the usual suspects. So, you know, people like Mark and Elliot. And really what you need, this is something Elliot has hammered home to me, is that a constitution, even an interim one, has to be something that has broad buy-in from as wide a section of the Scottish population as we can possibly achieve. It can't be something that's just produced by one tiny faction of the independence movement, because, you know, apart from anything else, that's going to be driving no votes. You know, if we've got one little faction over here that's producing stuff that they think is really great, but you've got all these other people over here that are looking at that going, God, I don't want to live in that country, that's a problem. So you need to have something that's, you know, broadly acceptable to almost everybody, even people that are no voters. They have to be going into that booth to vote no, thinking, even if this does come up, yes, that interim constitution that they've put together is something I can live with.
So it begs the obvious question, really, Chris. The SNP's been in power for like 12 years. It had an interim constitution in the document that you mentioned earlier in the referendum. Since then, there's been a stony silence. What has happened?
I think you hit very much on the problem there in that first sentence, that the SNP have been in government for 12 years. Actually, I've, you know, looked a lot at the sort of history of the way policy was developed in the party over time. Spoken to people like Norman MacLeod, Isabel Lindsay, who was, you know, very, critical in the sort of formation of policy in the party in the early days. I say the early days, like the start of devolution, just before devolution, that sort of period. And I think not being in government gives you a lot of bandwidth to do this sort of thing. When you're in government, you've got better things to do on a day-to-day basis, I think. I think that, and with the best will in the world, I think I'm going to come up with, a list of policies, and these are going to be absolutely everything we need to worry about. But the reality is that that's a very small subset of the things that a minister has to deal with on a daily basis. The stuff that has to be done, decisions that have to be made. And so
I hear what you're saying, and I accept that, and I think many people will. However, it does produce the most alarming incoherence. For example, we had, as one of our early guests, we had Andrew Wilson on the show. And the question I put to Andrew, and he gave the only reply he could, but I have to tell you, it was hugely unconvincing. And it was this. I asked him, producing a growth commission report when you haven't agreed upon the constitution, i.e. the values that underpin all of that, how do you know what sort of growth is desirable if you haven't already worked out the values which indicate what sort of growth you wish as a nation, as a state? And he said, I wasn't asked to do that. I thought, well, somebody ought to have been asked to do it before you were asked to produce a growth commission report.
Yeah.
And it's this incoherence, I think that alarms people. Yeah,
well, this is the sort of thing that is going to be really important. In the process of forming a constitution, don't want to come across as definitive because, like I said, I just facilitate. I don't make the policies, I just facilitate. But, what I've, seen from studying this sort of area is that you really do need that. You do need the sort of principles, the underlying principles that are going to govern your nation, very much hammered out in tablets of stone. And that's something that the people need to do. Iceland did this after the financial crash. They ran a citizens' assembly. They had quite a lot. I think they had like 1,000 people. It was a very big affair. And they worked on their constitution. And they produced these sort of basic principles of how their constitution should function and what was important and what was not important, which, we'll probably end up talking about well-being at some point. And, that's the sort of thing we really need to be doing, because everything else flows from that. Once you have these fundamental principles, like human rights, for instance, the other decisions flow from that. And there's no point trying to take the other decisions until you know what principles are going to be guiding those decisions. You're absolutely right.
But Chris, with respect, that's exactly what's happening. I mean, every day, almost, I pick up a newspaper or some communication that tells me the SNP are about to introduce a new this, a new that, a modified whatever. And I'm thinking, hold on a second, you haven't worked out the basic values. Yeah. How can you sit there and tell me that this is going to be good? I can see superficially it might be popular, but then there's lots of things that are popular that are not necessarily good. And I think the incoherence, if I can stick to that, if I may, actually produces a very odd set of outputs. It encourages people to go off and do stuff. I mean, I'll tell you what it feels like for me, who has a keen interest in constitutions. It feels like watching somebody build a house and adding an attic, some French windows, and there's no foundations. And so you're all you can think to yourself is, the more of this stuff you add on, the more likely it is that the whole damn house is going to collapse because you haven't dealt with the basics. Yeah. And how do you know if a set of French windows is the best arrangement or even the optimum arrangement if you haven't already worked out what your basic values are that underpin the nation? So even though it might be problematic, i.e. you need to go and consult, I accept all of that. I'm not suggesting it's plain sailing, but I think avoiding it produces a set of complications that are unnecessary and make further policy development even more challenging than it would be.
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, this is all relatively recent changes to the party's constitution. This committee's only been in existence 2 years. And that's exactly the problem that, was identified, that it's there to fix. That, we've reached a situation where we don't have that. We don't have those fundamental foundations. And now we're in government. And actually, we need to start making these decisions, regardless of whether we have these foundations or not. And actually, the bandwidth required to do that means you don't have any spare to actually do the job of laying the foundations. Fortunately, we've had a situation where we had an enormous influx of new members, very passionate, keen, excited new members after the referendum, and that's actually put us in a position where we have more resources. I think one of the tensions in the party has been that a lot of the people that were involved in the policy development process, before we came into government, found themselves in government. They were the MSPs, they were the ministers, and they just got on with doing what they've been doing before. And that kind of worked fine for a bit. 12 years later, 14 years later, goodness, we've had this massive influx of new members. They have sort of started to pick up the policy development process that was lying about, wasn't getting used. And we're kind of feeling our way towards having the best of both worlds. So my job is to start doing that sort of work, to put in these policy principles that say, right, this is why we make particular decisions. These are the moral and ethical underpinnings of what our policy is going to look like, and then we can apply those to any particular policy area. When we look at the evidence, we inform our decisions using these underlying ethical principles. But that's a job of work. It's a job of work for me to do and to get the heck on with, because, like I say, if we're going to be running a referendum this year, that's not a lot of time to get that work done.
It isn't. And let me make one suggestion, and that is that there have been a number of citizens' assemblies looking at various issues.
There have.
Perhaps a citizens' assembly ought to look at the most basic issue of all, which is go off and come back with recommendations for a written constitution.
So one of the things Elliot recommended to me, because I had a long conversation with him right after I got elected, was that we have a constitutional convention, ASAP, as soon as possible, even just a small one to come up with an interim constitution. And that's the sort of thing that, I'm a massive fan of citizens' assemblies, obviously. I worked my tail end off to get that first one up and running and happening. And, it's kind of snowballed a bit since then. And with a bit of luck, we'll be seeing a lot more of them in the future. It's certainly the sort of area where you would want your citizens, like they did in Iceland, to be doing that sort of work. But I would also, from having listened to Elliot and actually listened to what he was telling me, would caution that you can't just shut out the political class. So while you would want to have a citizens' assembly talking about the underlying principles and starting the work on the interim constitution, you also want to involve the politicians, much as you would want to shut them out.
Sure.
They're the people that are going to be having to implement this stuff.
Yeah.
So it has to be something that they're on board with as well. So these two groups need to work together to come up with something that, like I said, will be acceptable to the vast majority of people in Scotland.
I think if you were able to put it broadly, if the SNP were able to put in place a constitutional convention, it's interesting that almost every single separatist or secessionist group, that's the first thing they did. If you take the American example, right, the reason they decided to develop a written constitution was because they were fed up with some king, unelected, unappointed, deciding what was best for them. And then a whole bunch of ministers responsible to the king saying, yes sir, no sir, we can do this for you, we can do that for you. And by the way, we need to tax some more people. And they decided the bulwark against that happening again would be to have a constitutional convention and then produce a constitution. Now, I have to say, you're absolutely right. None of that was plain sailing.
No.
But It was their top priority.
Mhm.
They knew they may have to fight a war, which hopefully we'll never have to do. But despite that, they made that a huge priority. And I think there's a lesson there. Because if you look across the world, the same thing applies just about. That the independence movement was predicated upon a draft constitution, because that was the contract between the state, not a political party, but a state and the citizens. Let me make one other, this is a somewhat controversial point, Chris, so I'm qualifying it in advance. But some people who are not supporters of independence have said to me, there's a reason why the SNP are not enthusiastic about a written constitution. To which my answer is, what is that? My question, my response is, what is that? They said, because it suits the SNP leadership. I said, well, in what way, shape, or form does it suit the SNP leadership? Well, if they obtain independence, let's say the SNP obtains independence, and they're the main party, they would inherit all of the bad habits of Westminster. And there would be no constraint at all on the powers that first independent government would accrue. None whatsoever. They would be able to do whatever they wished. Now, apart from the fact that I don't believe that is the case, it does seem to me to be a missed opportunity, because it prevents the governing party talking to people who are not happy about independence and reassuring them that they will not be victimized when this new state comes into action. And that's a very important thing.
Like I said, it's on my list of things to get done before an independence referendum, because you're absolutely right. It's crucial. It's totally crucial. And that whole idea of, going for independence without a constitution already drafted, that's crazy. One of the things I asked Elliot about when I was talking to him about this, because he was talking about a variety of countries that he'd either been involved with or studied academically that had gone through some sort of constitutional change or upheaval, whether it's independence or some sort of constitutional revision. And he was telling me all the horror stories of what can go wrong. And so I said, well, what percentage of these go right in general? And the answer was 20%. So if you look historically over the last century, let's say, of countries seceding from the British Empire, for instance, places like Kenya, etc., going forward, they go wrong, and they go wrong a lot. Northern Ireland being a classic example of exactly this sort of thing going badly wrong. And there's a number of common elements that you can find in the processes that have gone wrong. One of them, Kenya, I seem to recall being in particular, being, we'll not bother. We'll write it after we're independent.
Yes.
Massive mistake. Huge red flag. Klaxon going off. That's a mistake. We're not doing that. Not on my watch, if I have any say over it. And the other one, similarly with Kenya, is not involving everybody. So, if you just have one faction writing the constitution, then obviously they're going to, even unconsciously, they're going to write in bias to that constitution that favours them. And that's going to mean that the other factions don't even recognise the constitution as legitimate. And, that's what can lead to situations like Northern Ireland. So, that's absolutely, again, massive warning, Klaxon. We're not going that way if I can help it. We'll write something that's sensible, that everybody can agree to, that everybody is comfortable with, even if it's only an interim constitution to get us started, and then we can work from there. But, we want to be, coming into this next referendum, reassuring people that are still going to vote no, that it won't be the end of the world. That it'll just be a disagreement. It'll just be, they didn't want it to be like this, but it won't be the end of the world. It won't be the end of their identities. It'll be as British the day after as they were the day before. And, they won't be some sort of excluded minority or, all the other horrible things that can go wrong in that sort of situation.
Kevin is saying that Independence Live is available to set up online conferences using Hopin.
I saw that. I'll hold him to that.
Oh, I think he'd be very pleased to be held to that. A question from Bobby Leckie, and by the way, let me say thank you very much, because I feel reassured, and it's greatly reassuring to hear you say what you've been saying. I don't want to diminish it anyway. I think this is important, the point you just made. Bobby Leckie is asking, can all suggestions be made public for the whole party membership for a test of agreement first, before the pre-selected member vetting policy is put before the committee? Final selection by popularity.
I'm not sure exactly what Bobby's getting at there, but so we should be. The new constitution has provision for there to be an online policy development forum where members can, come online and talk about whatever policy issues they have and ideas that they have, and that also contains a central archive of all the existing policy, which will make it easier to develop policy that isn't already existing policy, which is otherwise impossible to do. And that would give us an opportunity where, be far more transparency about what policy is being developed and by whom, and give individual members much more input into what's actually going on. So the final selection of the resolutions is by conference delegates. I suppose there's an argument to say that, I seem to remember making this argument last year, that you'd be better off putting the selection of the agenda resolutions to the entire membership, because what you're doing there is you're taking a list of resolutions and you're distilling it down to the resolutions that you're permitting delegates to discuss. There's a case to be made that it's better logically for the entire membership to decide what agenda items their delegates are going to discuss, rather than just delegates getting to decide what they're going to discuss. So, that's a possibility. We do party-wide stuff on, a number of selection processes and on, leader and deputy leader elections. So it's not, beyond the realm of sanity that we couldn't do that. And I think there's a reasonable, logical case to be made that it would be better to do it that way. But, that's for some down the line. Write a resolution, submit it, I'll sponsor it.
There you are, folks. Yeah. So, do you encourage people to get in touch with you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
How do they get in touch with you? Do they know how to get in touch with you, Chris?
Well, the easiest way is to get in touch with your own PEO, your own political education officer. They've all got my email address. They can get in touch with me, or you can ping me on Twitter or whatever.
And do you do online Zoom discussion with members and political officers?
We haven't yet. We were planning on doing something called listening zones, where we were going to go region by region and let grassroots members come and talk to us rather than us talking at them, which doesn't seem a particularly productive way of listening to people. So, but that hasn't come off because things have been a bit up and down over the last few weeks, so things have been a bit disrupted, and we've got an election in progress. But we will try to get to that shortly, so that people can actually interact with us, because obviously, when you've got that situation where you've got multiple steps in a communication process, so I only have access to the political education officers, so I don't spam the entire party with rubbish every day, which is fair enough. But that does mean that there's a link in the chain, and sometimes that breaks down. There's a number of branches and constituency associations that don't have a political education officer for various reasons. They should all have one. If you don't have one, you're in trouble. I'm coming for you. But that means that I can send out an email, and that whole branch has no idea what happened. There could be hundreds of members in that branch, completely cut out. So, in the first instance, go to your PEO. If you don't have a PEO, get a PEO, and otherwise there are other ways to contact someone at head office and get them to send it to me.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. So here you are, right at the centre of this policy development. If anything, you must have an enormous workload. But if anything, it's going to increase because, shows like this, people will get in touch now, which is you could say, well, that's a great thing because that's what I'm here to do. But it also seems to me that, as you say, we have an election coming up on May the 6th. What people will expect to see post May 6th, assuming the opinion polls are reasonably accurate and the SNP becomes majority government, maybe with some other pro-independence groups, Green and Alaba and who knows what else besides. I mean, you pretty much get 100 days, don't you, to show that this administration works. Otherwise, you run into the problems with people saying, oh, well, it's the same old lot again. They're not doing anything terribly constructive. So if anything, that will heap more pressure on you, I suspect.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll have the first series of reports from our expert working groups out about the time of the election. And then we will be cracking on to the next round of them, which is going to include stuff like the Constitution. It's likely going to include local government reform and land reform. There's another couple of topics that are in the mix there that we might do in that sort of second wave. But, because these are the big issues that are going to be important when you're, thinking we're going to set up a new country here. What's it going to look like? And that's the important thing. What vision of a new country are you going to be creating for people? So that's what we'll be doing immediately after the election.
Well, I'm glad you're speaking with Elliot Bulmer, because I don't think anyone knows nearly as much about constitutions as he does. He's a godsend to the country. We're running out of time. I did say this would go fast, Chris.
You did. You weren't wrong.
It goes. It just goes. Are there any messages that you would like to get over tonight to the folks watching and listening?
I suppose that SNP party policy is written by its members and nobody else. If you have a policy idea, or if you think there's a policy that the SNP currently has that's wrong, do something about it. Write a resolution, contact your PEO, contact your regional policy development rep, contact me, write something, and we'll put it to conference, and we'll change it if it needs changing. That's the way this should work. So don't be sitting there in the dark, all frustrated and annoyed and feeling powerless. No, you can do something about it. All policy is made by the members in the Scottish National Party, and that's the way it's always been. And while it is to some extent difficult to interact with that process, I'm here trying my best to make that easier, and I will continue to do so for as long as you, members of the party, let me.
Well, I hope that people in our audience tonight will see this and say, hey, if I had any reservations about the way policy is developed in the SNP, I hope you feel somewhat reassured and you have a place to go now. I mean, you've heard from the man himself. This is the way that things are done. You've got points of contact. Chris is constantly in touch with the membership and with the branches. And I hope this has been of interest and of value, because I know that when people join a political party, they're just full of enthusiasm and zest and want to get things done. And here you have a kindred spirit who feels exactly as you feel. So I would say, I'm not a member of the SNP, but I would say to all of those who are in the SNP and watching tonight, this is just about the most ideal arrangement you can think of, is somebody in policy development who's keen to hear from you. That doesn't happen everywhere else, by the way, let me tell you. So we're just about out of time. Let me say a big thank you to you, Chris, for joining us tonight. It's been great, and I hope you found it reasonably enjoyable at the same time.
Oh, no, absolutely my pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure. This is what my job is.
Thank you very much. We have, as always, a formidable list of guests coming up. And I need to tell you about next week's guest. You'll find, by the way, all the details on the What's On guide. You'll see at the bottom of your screen. Go there if you want to find out what's happening in any part of the Indie Live network. But I have to tell you specifically about next week's guest. Very special guest next week. We have Alex Salmon on the show. Now, for most of you, Alex Salmon will need no introduction, but it's not to be missed. Join us next week. But just as importantly, get your questions in. If you've got any thoughts, comments, or concerns about Alex Salmond, Alaba, whatever, the list system, all of that good stuff. For some people, it's quite complicated. And Alex will be here to explain all of that and much more besides. Oh, by the way, and this is very important, we've been trying for some time to get an invitation to Nicola Sturgeon to appear on the show. I thought perhaps we had a date, which is maybe the 28th. We've yet to hear back from the folks in the public relations department, but I do hope that they hear this as another invitation. Please, Nicola, come on the show. If you know of anyone who has contact with her or PR team, or if there's anyone watching tonight that has Nicola's ear, would you please extend this invitation to her? We'd love to have her on the show, answering your questions and putting her points. Oh, one other thing. My Constitution column on Sunday in the Sunday National, don't miss it. It's sometimes hard to find because it's at the back of the 7 Days supplement. But I can guarantee you it'll be worth taking the trouble to dig it out, because this week I'll be explaining why these two new reports that we've been discussing tonight with Chris are very bad news for the Tories. Very bad news indeed, and written by non-independent supporters. So also please support Indie Live. And thank you again for joining us. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. And before I go, the TNT show next week, that's the 21st, will feature Alex Salmond. Get your questions in now. Thank you for watching. Good night all. Take care and stay safe.